Like, oh my God, be careful. What are you going to do? You're going to blow yourself up. I'm like, there's not a lot of difference between the propane stove and the propane torch. It's the same element of risk, in fact. I think the torch was safer.
Hello and welcome to, well, Carlin's Worlds. Yeah, that should work. I'm a wanderer, a tinkerer, sometimes a nomad, a military veteran. I do things differently. There will be tinkering. I have a motorcycle, a truck, and a school bus. I live off grid, so there will be some solar, batteries, inverters, and maybe even some wind. It blows. And that's all I can fit into about 30 seconds. Oh, and please, if you like any of this, it would be really awesome if you could subscribe and click that notify bell. Drop a comment if you have any questions or ideas. Share, like, comment, subscribe, notify. Oh, and Patreon if you're really an awesome kind of person. Cool. On with the show already.
I guess I had this thought that I was going to ponder, and then I got sidetracked. And it ties to the road and to life out here in general. I've posted videos or photos of different little life hacks that I put together, and I thought about this when I was making my oatmeal. I think I'm on my fourth propane or camping stove. But yeah, there's been a few times where, I was living in the truck for a while in town because I was working in El Paso, and that was 100 miles from here one way. And I was driving that every day. It was costing me a fortune. So I realized that I could live in the truck. That's when I built a little camper. And by driving one day a week and then staying in town, I could drive the truck for less money than I could drive the motorcycle every day. I was like, wow. I did the math and it actually made sense. It was wonderful. Sometimes math is good. I had decided I was going to, I had bought, let's see, there was a butane stove I had. That one still works. I forget what happened. Walmart didn't have the fuel canisters for a while, I think is what happened. So then I had to go find another stove because I was trying to make oatmeal. And the one day, they didn't have a butane, or they had propane canisters, but no propane stove, or it was just like a mess. Or I had a little stove that quit working, and another one quit working, and another one ran out of fuel, and so I'm like, man, all I need to do is boil up a cup of water so that I can dump it on the oatmeal, and it's kind of good enough. And it was cold weather, and I really needed that to, have something to look forward to in the morning. And I'm looking around, and I'm like, well, okay, so I walk down a couple aisles into the hardware section, and right there is a nice propane torch for soldering your plumbing pipes. If you had like copper pipes, you can solder them. So here's a little propane torch. I'm like, that'll work fine. And it's the same propane. It just comes out in a little point instead of in a nice big dish, for heating up your water. So like, okay, so the next picture, in my live stream or whatever was, here's a propane torch balanced against one of my boots, and then I think I was just holding the pot above it, and I was moving it around so I wouldn't burn a hole in the bottom of the pan. I don't think you could, but it was just like, you know, you'd end up with, a really hot spot in the water and nothing else was getting hot. So I just kept moving it around slowly, and eventually I boiled the water and it worked good. I had more people, mostly family members back then probably, but they're like, oh my God, be careful. What are you going to do? You're going to blow yourself up. I'm like, there's not a lot of difference between the propane stove and the propane torch. It's the same element of risk, in fact. I think the torch was safer, right? Because it had a push button lighter in my stove. I had to reach in there with a lighter, so I was always burning my fingers until I got the longer lighter. I'm like, the propane torch it's still burning propane. It's not any more dangerous, really. I'm not doing it inside. I'm sitting out on the tailgate. So anyway, it was just, I find myself being annoyed and offended sometimes when my family is like, "Oh my God, be careful." I'm like, I'm not a freaking idiot, you know. Like, what am I gonna blow myself up with? It's yes, I'm not living a traditional lifestyle. I do not have electricity. I can't just turn on a valve, hit a switch and instantly have food. It's But this morning when I was making the oatmeal, it finally clicked, I think. And it's like, oh my God, be careful. No. I think that, at least in my world, yes, be a little bit aware of the dangers, but everything that I need, everything that I want, everything I'm working towards is on the other side of danger. There is nothing that I am getting by being safe. I am, in fact, being safe to the point of paranoia has prevented me from having the life that I want to have. And it's as simple as that. There is a lot of danger out here. There's a lot of risk. There's a lot of things that, you could die of a hangnail, I suppose, if you weren't really careful. Or just really unlucky. There's poisonous spiders. I've seen black widows inside the bus. They're mostly over there, but I'm like, oh, there's a black widow. And then by the time I got something to squash it with, because I'm like, no, I'm not going to catch and release a black widow. He's going to get squashed, or she. But I looked at it, and I'm like, oh, black widow. And then I turned around to grab a boot or something. I turned around, and it saw me coming, and it ran away. I'm like, well, okay. So I moved its little spider web. I've chased a couple of them away. Okay. So you got your black widows. You got how many other kinds of spiders? I've seen scorpions. Never in the bus yet, thankfully. I've seen things I can't identify. Some really scary looking bugs out here. And then you got the rattlesnakes. And so far the coyotes are keeping a pretty wide, range around me. But I've seen them. I hear coyotes a lot. There's been a few times early in the morning when I'm getting ready to go, I'll walk outside and I'll hear a yip, 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 coyote starting up over here. I'm like, oh, cool, coyotes are out, it's always kind of fun. They're barking at the moon or whatever. Then I'll hear one on the other side. I'm like, okay, I'm surrounded by coyotes. This is good, But I've never felt like they were, coming anywhere near me. So I'm okay with that, But, and then there's the road. I have to go down the road to get to work. And it's a calculated risk. Yesterday, I honestly felt it was safer in a overall sense to drive the motorcycle than it was to drive the truck. Because there was a very good likelihood that I would get the truck stuck or run into a hole and damage the truck or drop into a deep puddle and get the truck wet and then it would die. And then I'm looking at a few $100s to get a wrecker to come out here and pull me out. Side story on that. Going out yesterday, I did see a Ford, I think it was an Explorer or an Expedition, the big one, the Expedition, in the ditch on the wrong side of the road, half tipped over. It was a pretty deep ditch. So they had been probably trying to turn around in running water and dropped into a hole, and it was there. And so when I went by really slow, and I couldn't see anybody inside. So I'm like, okay, I'm on my way to work. I got to get going. So I went by, and then last night coming home, I noticed that the windows were rolled down, and the lady was sitting in there. I don't know. Okay, so I stopped and I talked to her for a couple minutes, and she was in a situation where she had gotten a ride out. Or walked out. I think she was she lived 4 or 5 miles from there. And she was, at the time I was talking to her, she was on the phone with roadside assistance. And this was probably 12 or 14 hours after she had gotten stuck. So she had probably gotten home, got a ride or whatever, and then was talking to roadside assistance to come out with a wrecker and pull her out. Because where she was, I got the feeling that people had tried to pull her out and couldn't, so they needed a wrecker. And she had 2 or possibly 3 wrecker companies refuse to come out and get her because of where we live. Okay. And I've had a similar situation. The time where I broke the chain on the motorcycle out on the freeway, and this is on the freeway. This is America. This is Texas. I'm on the freeway, and we could not get a wrecker to come out and get me, to haul me out here. Even though I was less than 100 miles, and they're supposed to take you up to 100 miles. This is what roadside assistance is supposed to do. And the very nice lady on the phone says, "We're very sorry. We have not been able to find you a wrecker that will take you home." I'm like, am I paying extra for roadside assistance on my insurance company? Or, what is this all about? Yeah, I was just like, wow. So I got mad and I started walking. That's the day I walked about 20 miles in a day across the desert in the heat of the summer. Yeah. And then this was all day, the next day, I caught a ride the rest of the way home and then got the truck and went back, so I missed a day of work. But yeah, be careful. It doesn't really work like that. If you want something, you might have to, you look at your risks and you decide, is this an acceptable risk or not? And it's different for everybody. But ultimately, it's up to you. And if what you want is worthwhile, you may have to go outside of your safe zone to get it. There was a quote I saw from Elon Musk, the guy who SpaceX, Tesla cars, he's got a solar company. Elon Musk is the guy that wants to have humans living on Mars. And I don't remember the exact wording, but he says something to the effect of, there are some things that even though the odds are against us, they're important enough for us to take the risk because it's worth it. And I think there's a lot to that. So if it means making your oatmeal with a propane torch because that's the best option you have, maybe it's not the best option in the world, but it's the best option you have today where you are, then you're going to make oatmeal with a propane torch. It'd probably be okay. Now, if you're the kind of person who easily catches water on fire, maybe you might look at your lifestyle and, stay where it's safer. But anyway, with that in mind, I need to get ready for work. Thanks for watching. Okay, when I made the previous video about Risk, I had not yet seen this video. This is Commander Chris Hadfield, a Canadian astronaut who spent time on the shuttle, flew one of the Russian Soyuz missions. He was the pilot, I believe, and has spent time on the space station. So look up this later. I'm just going to play a little bit of this for my reminder so I can find it again.
Everything worth doing in life has risk. Learn to ride a bike, learn to walk. When I was a kid learning to walk, I fell and cracked my skull. But I needed to learn to walk. Taking a test, getting married, getting a driver's license. All of those things, they give you an improved capability or an improved richness in life, but they all come with a degree of risk. That is exaggerated if the thing that you want to do is fly a rocket ship. Rocket ships are dangerous. It's a controlled explosion. If you drew a cartoon of a rocket, what it would be a bomb with 6 seats on the top. I mean, rocket ships are crazy dangerous. On the first flight of the space shuttle, when Bob Crippen and John Young were sitting there back in 1981 and they blasted off out of Florida, now that we go back and we look at what the actual history of the space shuttle was, their odds of dying that day in the first 8.5 minutes were 1 in 9. Terrible odds, 1 in 9. I mean, look around you at 10 people and realize that just to try that 1 in 9 times, they would have died. They got away with it, and we learned a lot from it. But even
1 in 9. Now, they probably didn't exactly know that, but they didn't have a way to flight test the space shuttle without putting people on it. They didn't launch an empty one, because they didn't have the capability back then to do an automatic landing of the space shuttle. Most of the other rockets that NASA built, I think all of the other rockets that NASA built, they flew empty rockets first. And then put a crew on them. But the space shuttle was so complex that they still wanted to have a human pilot crew to land it again. So they didn't have a way to flight test it without actually just doing it. When something is important enough, you do it, even if the odds are not in your favor. Elon Musk. When something is important enough, you do it, even if the odds are not in your favor. It's mind-boggling, some of the projects that he has taken on and made work. Now, there's still obviously failure involved. He created a software company, essentially, PayPal. It wasn't his first company, but it was the first one that we really think of. Made it work. Created a way for people to transfer money and buy and sell things internationally in a way that people felt relatively safe doing it. When you think about it, it's like, okay, I'm going to buy something from China and I'm going to use my credit card to buy it. If you think about that on the gut level, who the frick is going to do that? But by using PayPal, you have an intermediate. I'm paying my money to a company that I have some trust in, and they are paying the person I'm buying the stuff from. And because they had enough checks and balances, they created a way for me to figure out as my thing gets here that it's going to get here. And I think most people, when it comes right down to it, your first purchase on eBay isn't very big, usually just to make sure that it works kind of thing. So, through a progression of steps, he created PayPal and then sold it and took some of that money and created, I'm trying to think if it was, what was in between, but he realized that there was a gap in the space launch business that he could fill because he understood how things worked. And I'm going to really oversimplify this, but he was able to understand that he could build a rocket company around an idea of being able to reuse some of the parts in a way that nobody else had. You look at the space shuttle. The shuttle itself was reusable, but it was enormously expensive. They spent so much time refurbishing between every flight, it was almost unpractical. The solid rocket boosters were recovered and reused, but they landed in salt water, and so they had to spend a lot of time cleaning them up and getting them ready to fly. the massive fuel tank was lost every time they built a new tank, every time they flew it. Because it was so big, it was impractical to recover it. They just let it, break up and go in the ocean. What SpaceX was able to do, what Elon Musk was able to envision, was that it would be possible to land a rocket on its feet. And it took him a few tries to do it. I think he destroyed one of his drone ships. So he had built basically a barge, because it was pretty dangerous to try to land a rocket on land at first. Nobody wanted him to try it. So he builds this ship and puts it out in the ocean. And when the first stage of the rocket came back, it relighted its engines and it came down and it landed right on its tail. It had little landing feet. I mean, this was so science fiction. I mean, this is what all the cartoons showed rocket landings looking like. And I remember, I'm a big space geek, and when I first heard of him, I hadn't heard his story. I just heard of the idea that he wanted to land a rocket and reuse it. And I'm like, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. I'm like, if even NASA isn't even looking at that, why in the hell is he thinking this is going to be a good idea? I just totally wrote him off as an idiot, I mean, what a waste of time, And you start looking deeper into his story. Between SpaceX and Tesla, which were happening more or less at the same time, apparently Tesla, the car company, wasn't his originally. He invested into it and then I think at some point bought a major share in it, but it was actually not a car company he started. He was interested in the idea of electric cars, and I think he found a company that was already getting started, and then he became a major backer of it, and so it's basically his name on the company. But my understanding is it wasn't his company to start with. He didn't decide, okay, let's make an electric car company, right? So there was a clip I saw, part of a documentary, I guess, that I think I saw it on YouTube, but I don't remember where it was from, where he was in the warehouse with one of his engineers, and this was the first car, I think, because his first idea was make a low volume car, make a few very expensive cars first, because there's people that had money that would buy an exclusive car that it wouldn't be their only car, right? So like say you got money, you might buy a Ferrari, but it's not going to be your daily driver, it's just going to be a fun car, and then you'll have something else you drive for your daily car, because you'd also have a Mercedes, and then on the weekend you take out the Ferrari just because it was fun to drive, but it wouldn't be what you would drive to work all the time. Okay, so you think about it like that. So he creates, don't quote me on all of this because it's just from memory, but he creates the first, the Roadster, right? And it was pretty cool. But in the beginning, he had a horrible time with quality control. I mean, it wasn't his hand on the screwdriver. He built the idea, and then he had, created a company and sets up an assembly line, and he had hired workers, and they were building these cars, and they were not. I think the issue was that they were not. Most of them, the assembly people, were not hired from other car companies. I think he's got the plant in California, so there's not an auto industry in California the way there is in Detroit. So you couldn't just put a Craigslist ad and say, hey, we're starting a new car company, would you like to come work for us? A previous auto experience would be nice. He didn't have a large pool to pull from, I think. So when he was creating the cars, this one clip, they were in a warehouse, and the engineer says, okay, these cars didn't pass quality because of this, these cars didn't pass because of this, these cars didn't pass because of this, and he looks out, and there is probably a few 100, maybe 1,000 cars sitting there finished that didn't pass quality. And the look on his face was, "Whoa, I didn't realize it was this bad." You know, he's like, "Okay, some cars aren't making it through quality checks," but he didn't realize how bad it was. Okay. So at the same time that's happening, roughly at the same time, he's in probably 4 or 5 failures in a row where his rocket exploded on the launch pad or didn't make it to orbit or didn't make it through the first 10 seconds before it blew up. Okay. And these were not the big giant rockets that we see now that SpaceX is flying. But he had lost several satellites at this point, you know, where he convinced a company, you know, or a country, you know, yeah, we can launch your satellite for this amount of money, and then it blew up. Okay, we're sorry, do you have another satellite? We'd like to try it again. And they're kind of like holding on to it. It's like, I don't know, the last one blew up. Do we want to give you this? Because this is, you know, they're expensive. You know, you build a satellite. It's not just a box. It's some pretty expensive stuff. So, but if you think about his quote, even when the odds are not in your favor, sometimes it's worth the risk. And because he's a very gifted engineer, he was able to look at every failure and figure out what happened and move forward to the point that eventually he got the first rocket not only to fly, I mean, he had several that flew, and then he started flying them with the landing legs installed, and every time they flew a rocket, and this was the genius part on his part, he had paying customers helping to cover his research time, right? So he would get a rocket to launch, deliver a payload. He would take that money to build the next rocket, but also to fund his research and development time. And so every time they flew, he would then incrementally make it just a little bit more interesting. He would add another feature. And then once the rocket, you know, the second stage would go and the satellite would keep going, then he would start playing with the first stage that was done, and he'd learn how to get that engine to relight so that it could land. And then he developed a way to steer it, and then he developed a way to get it in the right position such that it would then slow down, relight, aim towards where it was supposed to go, coast, and then at the last, you know, 30 seconds or something crazy like that, it would relight, the main rocket would slow it down, and it would come down to a feather landing, boop, and it would just be, you know, and then the smoke would clear, and here's this rocket standing. And it's like, people had never figured that out before. This is freaking brilliant, you know. And there is actually other companies that are doing similar things, but he's doing it very, very well. But the key point is, he was basically at the point where Tesla was about to go under because he had such horrible quality problems. He couldn't sell the cars. He couldn't build them fast enough, and then he couldn't deliver them because they weren't very good. And, you know, so he had to really get that figured out. And he was blowing up rockets left and right. Yeah. So there was a point that both of these problems were happening at the same time, and he was probably, you know, you're at the point, well, okay, you've already staked your fortune on it, and you're losing money left and right. And there's a point where you can't lose any more money because you don't have any more money to lose, and that was about where he was at. You know, if it didn't work soon, okay. Jumping ahead, he then solved those problems in a way that he was able to win a contract with NASA to send cargo to the International Space Station. And he's done, I'm trying to think if they lost one of those. I think they did. But his record is basically on par with any other space rocket company now. And he's been flying enough of what they call the Dragon capsule that they're now on track to start putting people on them because they've got a good enough safety record to do that. And so now him and also Boeing they're not working together, but they have equal contracts. So they're both sending up cargo and so on, I think. Boeing, yeah, I think Boeing is the other one. I know Boeing has one. So now they're both at the point where Boeing and SpaceX are getting close to sending the first humans back to the space station, because since we quit flying the space shuttle, all of the astronauts and cosmonauts and other nations have their own names for their astronauts, but the other astronauts are all going on Russian Soyuz spaceships. And we knew there was going to be a gap, but what's interesting is going forward, NASA isn't going to be in the business of taking astronauts to the space station. They're going to leave that to the Russians and Boeing and SpaceX, and then anybody else that comes along that's able to do that, which is just kind of a strange way to do it. But it's cheaper to rent a car than it is to buy the car, and that's kind of the direction NASA is going, is they will buy the tickets and pay the money to whoever can deliver on a per seat basis. And so SpaceX stepped up and says, yeah, we can do that. But Elon Musk's point of view, his mission isn't to put people on the space station. His mission is to put people on Mars. Yeah, okay. So what he's doing is rather clever. He's having NASA, he's making money from NASA and from other companies and countries by delivering cargo for them to wherever they want it, to the space station, to different orbits, and so on. And then he's taking his profits and he's putting it into his dream of making a rocket that'll go to Mars. This is very important, and it's also very useful for me, because the book I'm writing, the story I'm writing, I don't always call it a book, because sometimes I'm writing it in my mind first as a comic strip that then may become an animated video, cartoon, comics, book, live action movie, TV series, web series. That part's a little fuzzy. How do I deliver my story is the questionable part. We'll see some of each probably, hopefully. But it's all about how do you get cargo to Mars in enough quantity to then be able to put people on Mars, because you can't put people on Mars if there's no stuff on Mars first. It's very expensive. But if we look at how people like Elon Musk are seeing it, this is what's interesting about writing my story, is the pieces are coming together in my lifetime. This isn't science fiction. This isn't Star Trek. This is now. And one of the first things I wrote, and I've found it a few times, and it used to be taped to the ceiling, and I don't remember exactly where, but my storyline for the story I'm writing is going to pick up from after the space shuttle and before Star Trek. So this is the window I'm working in. How did we, it was kind of like, okay, I loved watching Star Trek. To me, Star Wars was always in a galaxy far, far away. That's somewhere else. But Star Trek starts here. And so I thought was, okay, Star Trek with Captain Kirk was like 500 years in the future, I think. Something like that. But how did we get to there? And then we look at Enterprise, which was supposed to be before Captain Kirk, but it was one of the last series that they did. So we look at that and we're like, okay, it kind of sort of showed the progression of how did they get to the first Enterprise. I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool, So we needed a way to get, heavy things off of Earth, but once they're off of Earth, then it doesn't take very much power to move them. So you take a company like SpaceX and they get heavy things off of Earth. Now SpaceX also wants to go to Mars, but if we looked at it from a different point of view, if we could pay a company like SpaceX to put our heavy things up in orbit, then we could build our own spaceship in orbit where it's just coasting. So it'd be like assembling the International Space Station. They couldn't get it up there in one piece. They assembled it in pieces. It took them quite a while because they put them all on the space shuttle. So they had to make them small enough to fit in the space shuttle. Okay. So we find another way to do sort of the same thing. We use a company that gets heavy things off of Earth. We assemble our spaceship, and then we go from Earth to Mars. That's overly simplified. But we've been sending things to Mars my whole lifetime. It wasn't very long after we put the people on the moon and brought them back that we started sending robots to Mars. And for a long time, it was just assumed that we would be going to Mars. And then all these years later, we've got people sitting in low Earth orbit. We haven't even gone back to the moon. So my hope for writing my story, it's a little bit like The Martian and some others that are out there. But it's my point of view is a little bit, is different. It's, I didn't just copy The Martian. In fact, I had wrote a lot before I was aware of The Martian. Sometimes, I don't know if I need to keep saying that, but I do. I mention it that I'm not doing this just because of The Martian. But, and when Andy Weir wrote The Martian, his story is wonderful. Read the book. It's very, very, very well written. I loved it. But, NASA had been talking about Mars. We've got rovers on Mars now actively driving around and so on. And we've got satellites around Mars. So him writing a story about going to Mars, his work is original, but the idea of going to Mars has been around for a long time, probably most of his lifetime too. Okay. So, all right, whatever. I guess my point is, for that, it's not an original idea to go to Mars. It's just, how you write it is your original contribution to the idea. But my goal, my hope, is like all the others, in addition to, being wildly successful as an author or whatever, and, maybe making some money from it, that would be wonderful, but that's a little bit shallow. But what if I can inspire the next generation? Because we've lost a lot of our competitiveness or our edge, or it's pretty rare to talk to a kid that wants to be an engineer, that wants to be a rocket scientist. It's, when we were doing Apollo, that was a big deal, and people were very excited about it. It was in the news all the time. And then by the time we got to flying the space shuttle, they barely showed it on the news unless something bad happened. The first few shuttle missions, they stopped what they were doing, and everybody watched the TV of the first space shuttle launch, back in the 80s. And then it became so routine. I mean, the video from Chris Hadfield, later in the video, I think he says, from looking back, they calculated their odds after knowing that they lost 2 space shuttles in the history of the space shuttle. His odds were like 1 in 38 of dying on that mission. Yeah, this is not jumping on an airliner and flying back to California. This It's dangerous business. But something Chris Hadfield said one time was one of his goals as an astronaut was to fly enough missions and to learn enough and to help fix enough problems that then space flight became safe enough that the average person would take the risk and go fly. And that's kind of, we're on the edge of that now. There's been a few space tourists who put up the money to fly with the Russians on a spare seat and go up to the space station for a couple weeks and then come back. But it's pretty rare. So the next step is to get enough people involved and excited, because if you don't have enough of a demand, if you don't have a few thousand people that want to go to Mars to live on Mars, it's never going to happen. It's just too expensive. So I think my hope is to show, in a fictitious sort of a way, that it's a possibility and that maybe it would be worth the risk. All right. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned.
Well, that's about it. Thank you so much for watching. Yeah, that should work. Cool. I do things differently. Oh, and please, if you like any of this, it would be really awesome if you could subscribe and click that notify bell. Drop a comment if you have any questions or ideas. Share, like, comment, subscribe, notify. Oh, and Patreon if you're really an awesome kind of person. Thank you so much for watching.